Hello and welcome to this recording of an analysis of Mametz Wood by Owen Sheers. As normal, we're going to look at the same three assessment criteria: AO1, the meaning of the poem; AO2, language, form and structure; and AO3, the context. Owen Sheers tends to write about places and landscapes, but is really interested in people who live or have lived within them. It is people, their lives and their families that provide the focus for most of his work, especially the difficulties people face in simply trying to live. He was visiting the Battle of the Somme when he saw the excavation of the soldiers described in the poem as they were slowly released from the earth. So the question would then be, why did he choose to focus particularly on Mametz Wood?
2016 sees the centenary of the Battle of the Somme in northern France, perhaps the most famous battle of the First World War. It led to over 1 million men and women being killed or wounded on both sides. Wales has a special place on the Somme. Welsh soldiers took part in the fighting on the first day, the 1st of July 1916, and many lost their lives. A few days later, on the 7th of July, the soldiers of the Welsh division were ordered to attack Mametz Wood, the largest wood on the Somme, covering over 200 acres. The German soldiers had dug in and were supported by machine guns and artillery fire. The Welsh soldiers, who just 2 years earlier had been miners, dockers, farmers, teachers, and a whole range of other ordinary occupations, now faced the best trained army in the world. At 8:30 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of July, they left the cover of their trenches and advanced across open fields towards the wood. The Germans opened fire, and 400 Welsh soldiers were killed or wounded in a short period of time. They never reached the wood. On the 10th of July, they were ordered to try again, so at 4 a.m. hundreds of them advanced towards the wood. This time they made it, and engaged the Germans in hand-to-hand fighting amongst the trees and the undergrowth. German reinforcements flooded in, but by 6:30 p.m. that day, most of the wood was in Welsh hands. The following day, more attacks took place to finally drive the Germans out. The fighting for Mametz Wood was now over. It had cost the Welsh division 4,000 casualties, about a third of their infantry strength.
The poem Mametz Wood by Owen Sheers then documents farmers finding bodies under the ground in the woods. These soldiers are found in pieces, small parts of the body that are found bit by bit. Here then is Owen Sheers himself speaking first about his own experience of the wood and then reading his own poem.
I wrote this poem, Mametz Wood, when I went to the Somme battlefield to make a short film about two Welsh writers who had fought at this place. The two writers were called David Jones and Wyn Griffiths, and they wrote very, very different accounts of this dreadful battle. But it was a strange battle because there seemed to be lots of poets present. It was also where Robert Graves was wounded. C.V. Sassoon actually watched the battle. So it's a battlefield of the Somme that appears again and again in the memoirs of poets and actually in their poetry. And I really wrote this because while I was there, they uncovered a shallow grave of 20 Allied soldiers who had been buried very, very quickly, but whoever had buried them had taken the time to actually link their arms, arm in arm. And when I saw a photograph of this grave, I just knew it was one of those images that had burned itself onto my mind, and that I knew that I would want to write about it eventually. As it happens, I did, but the poem took a long time to surface, very much in the same way that those elements of the battle are still surfacing through the fields 85 years later. Mametz Wood. For years afterwards, the farmers found them, the wasted young, turning up under their plough blades as they tended the land back into itself. A chit of bone, the china plate of a shoulder blade, the relic of a finger, the the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull, all mimicked now in flint, breaking blue in white, across this field where they were told to walk, not run, towards the wood and its nesting machine guns. And even now the earth stands sentinel, reaching back into itself for reminders of what happened, like a wound working a foreign body to the surface of the skin. This morning, 20 men buried in one long grave, a broken mosaic of bone linked arm in arm, their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre in boots that outlasted them, their socketed heads tilted back at an angle, and their jaws, those that have them, dropped open, as if the notes they had sung have only now, with this unearthing, slipped from their absent tongues.
Before we go on to then look at the key details of the poem itself, let's have a look at the poem as a whole. Now, as we can see here, immediately, obviously, we have stanzas of groups of 3 lines. These are called tercets. And why would he use that? Well, it's a very regimented structure for a poem very much about soldiers. But it's also very uniform, 3, 3, 3. So perhaps this could be symbolic of the soldiers' footprints or boot prints in the earth. Perhaps the second thing you might notice of the title itself, the place where the poem is set. This is in the Battle of the Somme in France. For years afterwards, so you've got a long period of time when these soldiers these farmers suddenly start digging up these soldiers under the ground. For years afterwards, the farmers found them. Now, a farmer's job is to create life. But here, that's subverted as they seem to be finding death. Farmers found them, the wasted young, implying then these soldiers' lives have been wasted or ruined. Turning up under their plough bays, they tended the land back into itself. A chit of bone. Now we begin to get these soldiers' body parts. There are several links to how fragile these soldiers actually are. We have bone, plate, shoulder blade, breaking, nesting, then further down, broken, all suggesting these soldiers are fragile. But then we also have, next to these fragile words that suggest somebody who's valuable. Words like china, words like bird's egg, perhaps blue, the word mosaic. Quite a few of these are right next to each other, comparing then the fragile nature with the beauty of these soldiers. That means the poem has got repeated oxymorons, suggesting then the soldiers are easily broken, but perhaps at once precious. We then have references back to the top here, returning up under their plough blades. Plough blades is a plosive, the p and the b. These sounds almost cutting through the poem, like the plough itself is cutting through the ground. They tended the land back into itself, as if they're folding over time and uncovering history. A chit of bone, a chine plate of shoulder blade, a relic. That's another link there to how precious they are. A relic of a finger, the blown and broken bird's egg of a skull, suggesting there the violence of war, the reason why they died. all mimicked now in flint, breaking blue in white across this field, where they now blue in white might suggest, half suggests, the English flag. But it's incomplete, perhaps like the soldiers are incomplete. Across this field where they were told to walk, not run. Now this is a reference to what happened during the war itself, this battle itself. The Welsh were told to walk towards Mametz Wood. They were facing Germans with machine guns. And of course those Germans just mowed down these Welsh troops, but they refused to run, they just kept walking forward. Eventually they won, but purely down to numbers rather than technical skill or the skill of their officers. Towards the wood and its nesting machine guns. This implies then, obviously nesting links to birds and life, and machine guns then being death, another oxymoron being used there. These machine guns are comfortable, they're embedded in the wood, they can't be removed easily. These are then nests of death rather than nests of eggs and life. Even now, the earth stands sentinel. The earth here is personified, as if the earth is looking after these bodies. Sentinel is something that guards something. Personified, as if the earth is guarding the soldiers. And only now letting them go. Reaching back into itself for reminders of what happened. The poem itself is, of course, a reminder of what happened. Like a wound, working. The alliteration here, almost sounding exactly what it means. Wound, working. It deliberately slows us down and makes us dig into the language. A foreign body to the surface of the skin. Perhaps it's a reference to healing. This poem is supposed to heal us, make us remember these brave soldiers as a way of perhaps memorialising them. This morning, now we've got this sudden present tense appearing here. This morning, 20 men buried in one long grave. I think we're supposed to slow down here to help us imagine the imagery here of these 20 soldiers in one grave. This links to many shots of the First World War and all the soldiers lined up in their body bags. One long grave, the broken mosaic of bone linked arm in arm. It's as if implying they're a team even in death. They're still proud to fight together even though they're now dead. And that fighting caused their death. Their skeletons paused mid-dance macabre. Now the pause here, this indicates, of course, that this is like a freeze of time, a frozen space in time as we pause and remember these soldiers. Very much like the 1 minute silence, perhaps, that we'd have on Memorial Day. And then we have dance macabre. Now this is a very interesting phrase to use. This links to an artistic allegory. The dance of the dead. The thinking is that we all, in the end up dead as skeletons, and at that point we all dance together. It reminds us that we are all going to die and we're unified in death. This then is a reference to how we will all end. In boots that outlasted them. Their socketed heads, this is pretty grotesque, their socketed heads tilted back at an angle and their jaws, those that have them, dropped open. It's as if they're silently screaming. Yet nobody can hear those stories that they might scream. No one can hear their calls. As if the notes they had sung have only now, with this unearthing, slipped by their absent tongues. Just again, ramming home this sense that these soldiers are calling for help, or perhaps calling for us to remember them. But they can't speak. We're left then at the end of the poem, pondering these skeletons in the line, seemingly dancing, their mouths hanging open, singing almost choir-like about the world they live in and perhaps how they died. Key things about this poem to remember then. Who? It is Owen Sheers writing about Mametz Wood and the bodies of the dead soldiers that were unearthed there. What? Farmers start to dig up the soldiers in Mametz Wood as they prepare the earth for seed. Slowly the soldier comes to the surface. The skeletons lie united, almost silently singing. Why did he write it? Shears wants us to remember the young, enthusiastic soldiers who died with their countrymen in and around Mametz Wood. As normal, I'm now going to show 3 quotes then that you might find useful come the exam. Quote number 1, and please freeze the screen if you need to after each quote's come up. And quote number 2. And quote number 3. As normal, if I was focusing on this poem and answering an exam question, I'd follow the 9-step structure. As you can see, the ones in red are those that are the most important, with the ones in black being added to if the exam board gives you time. Now, in this exam, timings are really, really important. Each one of these steps represents a skill you've got to use. So we begin by making a statement about the part of the poem studied, not using quotes. We just want to show there we understand what's happening in each section of the poem. I get asked in the class, where exactly is the beginning, middle and end? Well, really that's up to you to decide, as long as the poem's divided into 3 sections. You then add in your poet knowledge, in this case about Owen Sheers. Number 3 is using short quotes, those collections of quotes that have something in common. That could be a lexical field, it could be a semantic field, it could simply be a group of words that you've noticed have the same kind of effect. And you briefly explain that in round about a sentence. Number 4 then is the first part of the key way of getting a grade 5. You want to choose a 5-word quote that you can analyse and pick words from. If you can't analyse the quote, you don't choose it. Ideally, you choose 2 lines of a poem, so that allows you to look at enjambment later. If you only use 1 line, you're limited on commenting on its structure. You then clearly explain why you chose that quote. Now, at the beginning of this poem, you've got about 6 to 8 lines to choose from. So you're telling the exam board, why did you focus on the line that you actually did? Number 6, you then zoom in on particular words used in your 5-word quote. Select only 1 word to focus on, but make sure it's the one you can say the most about. Number 7, you comment on the sentence structure or the enjambment. Why has the line been cut up the way it has? Is there anything particularly important about the style of sentence? Is it a statement? Is it a question? And perhaps the punctuation would also get you some marks here. Number 8, sprinkle on a bit of tone. What is the mood or atmosphere of the line you've chosen? In this case, because it's a war poem, likely to be a sombre or sad tone. Other poems, of course, differ. They could be more light-hearted. And number 9, another key important step, clearly state what your reader should be thinking at this point, linking to the question you were asked. So if you're asked about nature, you use the word nature. If you're asked about loss, you use the word loss at this point. What you're trying to say is how the reader reacts to that opening of the poem. Well, in this case, Owen Sheers wants us to think about both the farmers and what the farmers have found. So we might be surprised, but we're also quickly bombarded with words that link to fragility. So we might be reminded how fragile life is, how obliterated these soldiers were in Mametz Wood, and perhaps how they fell to pieces due to the German bombardment. In the middle of the poem, I think we're thinking about something a bit different there. We're thinking about almost the reverence of the soldiers, how important they were, what they went through before they died. By the end of the poem, we're left to think about this particular group of 20 men that Owen Sheers himself saw. We're left thinking about what caused their deaths and what they'd say if they could still talk. We have this horrific, grotesque image right at the end that makes us really think about what war means and perhaps what these soldiers have gone through.